We're going to continue with the Shelsheles Shel Halacha of Rabbi Zev Wolf Leiter, who was a rabbi in Pittsburgh in America after he left Europe towards the beginning of the 20s. 1921 is, I believe, when he went over to Pittsburgh. He was in New York for about a year. After we've discussed this Bev David, the work that he wrote on Gittin as a child to prepare himself into that area of Gittin and continued to involve himself on the active level of Aguna, etc., and bring succor and salvation to many young women from the problems and the devastation of Aguna, as well as keeping the children kosher for the people of Israel, to anyone in Israel, and not to be stigmatized by mamzerut, anything that would render them outside the pale of being able to marry any other Jew amongst the Jewish people. I would like at this point to point out that right after the war, the Second World War that is, an edition of the Sha'arei Tshuva was put out. This edition was an edition of Tshuvot HaGaonim. And as I mentioned before, Rabbi Leiter was very much involved, even his young years, with the writings of the Gaonim. A area which for many even great scholars in Europe, in the rabbinate, for them this was a area that they were not familiar with. In his teens, he was already bringing this down in his writings. The Tshuvos HaGaonim. This work was printed by Schulzinger. They're very good on classics and always were. In conjunction with this, Rabbi Leiter put in Ha'oris, Hagois, and that was eventually reprinted in another edition. Nobody told him to, but when they did print this edition of Tshuvos, and I think maybe in the 70s, on the spine, if you'll look closely, they write, this is the Rabbi Leiter edition, okay? They didn't ask us, and my father was not, how should we say, makbid, or worried about people reprinting his material for the use of scholars and learned people. Not at all. So, but this was an important work, a very important work, and a very seminal work in terms of halacha, very much so, brought down by many of the early commentators, and also these ha'oris of Rabbi Leiter showing where it was brought down later on are very important to be able to look up how the later authorities would make use of these decisions of the Gaonim. And in some cases, as he writes in a Movoy, an introduction, there are points here that the Gaonim differed completely, or said the opposite of what some later authorities did, or thought was correct, and therefore, from the standpoint of halacha, they were extremely important. Now, in addition to that, Rabbi Leiter went further. This is the edition, not the first edition, but this edition was first printed, I believe, in 1954 by Rabbi Leiter. The Tshuvos, the responsa of Rabbeinu Isaac Alfasi, which to a great degree was not studied and utilized in any manner that would resemble the usage of Rabbi Alfasi on the Talmud, known as the Rif on the Talmud. This was terra incognito, okay, almost, in many cases. Rabbi Leiter felt this was an important part of that chain of halacha. Directly after the Goinim, and even as Maimonides states in his Hagdamah, his introduction to the Mishnayos in the Seder of Zroim, that this was a major, major work. As he goes through all the works from the Talmud and post-Talmud, that summarized many of the people's work that came after the Talmud. You see, made a summary, as it were. Almost it was like an Aristotelian, put it all together. Put it all together. And there was a rare few places that you could disagree with the Rebbe. Perhaps 10. Later on, I think he found a few more. But in the meantime, he was very effusive in his praise. And this is an important work in the chain of halacha. With Rabbi Leiter's notes showing how people would bring this down and how it was discussed, etc., etc. Again, the chain of halacha continues. At this point, I would like to inform you also of one other item before I go forward. I mentioned to you already before that Rabbi Leiter had done works on Gittin, and we've covered it in this discussion. In the early 1950s, when I was in the yeshiva, I came upon a Gemara that was produced, not the Goldman Shas that we know from the East End, but the Goldman Shas that was produced by the Naipester Rab, who used to argue with Rav Moshe in Din Torah, and supposedly was able to hold his own to some degree. He was quite a Talmud Chacham, Hungarian, knew halacha, backwards and forwards. He printed a copy of the Talmud, and in the Talmud, which I was learning at the time, there was a Masechta Gittin, a tractate on Gittin. In the beginning, he writes, Zois Lemoidoi, that the Rosh Tevis, the acronym, Chop Yud Mem, Chop Yud Beis, Aleph Pei, Ksav Yad Minkin, Ksav Yad Airport, and Ksav Yad Berlin. All of these were taken from the Sefer V'Torosah Shel Rishonim on Gittin by Rabbi Wolf Leiter of Pittsburgh. And we mentioned other things that he did right on the page with putting down the letters Mem Shin Reish, that we were malak at them, we took them, we gathered them from the work of Rabbi Leiter. Keep in mind, this is in the early 50s. No one in over 100 years had their works put on the page, not in the back, on the page of the Talmud. There may be not that many of them, but they were there. You have the Hagoyah Shabach, you have Rabbi Kiveger. Very few, and only the very great, merited this position. And there was no ishtadlus, there was no effort by Rabbi Leiter to do this. It was a surprise to him when I called him to tell him that he was in the Talmud. He was obviously happy. He sounded happy over the phone, but not overwhelmed. But in any case, this is an idea of whom we are talking about. Besides his interest that you can see in the Shelsheles halacha and the treating of it with such respect and importance and centrality of the Jewish people's life and maintenance over the centuries. This tells us the esteem in which he was held, even in his own time, and by people who knew how to learn, how to study, and who were scholars and Gedolim in their own right. I will proceed in our next segment to go a little bit further, which is even more interesting, perhaps, than some of the things that I've said till now. It takes us up to the present day, perhaps.